Good morning and welcome back to the Great Lakes Black Authors Expo and Writers Conference 2021. We are virtual this year, and this has actually been kind of fun and relaxing for me to do it virtual. My feet will not be hurting at the end of this conference. So welcome. This is the first panel, but before we get into the panel discussion, I want to give you a little brief history. Great Lakes Black Authors mission is to encourage ongoing literary efforts, highlight literary achievements, and to promote literacy initiatives within the African American community of the Great Lakes region and beyond. So this is the purpose behind our discussion today. Our theme this year is Our History is American History, and part of American history was the anti-literacy laws of the antebellum period or slavery period. We have gone digital as an organization this year. So in addition to this virtual conference, we have created a video series called Book Tastings. We piloted that and it will be coming back this spring. We also launched a Storyteller magazine. This here is the conference edition. If you want to get this copy, you can subscribe to the magazine and you'll get the conference edition with the stories of everyone that's been involved in this conference in the award ceremony and discussions about our topic discussions for today. This was the premiere issue in the fall, which with best-selling author Nalena Kai on it. So we do have a magazine. It's also free to read online. If you go to glbaexpo.com, you will get the you can see the free readable version online, but if you want the paper copies, you need to subscribe to that magazine. We also have launched the Great Lakes Black Authors Directory. So if you are a published author and you want to list yourself as a part of the organization, you can join the directory also on glbaexpo.com. So that, I believe, is that for the housekeeping end of it. So we're going to pull in our panelists today as we talk about the literacy laws and discussing the history of them and bringing us to the current. So before we get into that, I want my panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with ladies first, not doctor, but Denise Harrison.
Hi, my name is Denise Harrison. I'm a professor of English at Penn State University. I teach the English department, but also in the Department of Pan-African Studies. Pan-African Studies is a social activist department, and so we teach the Black diaspora from a social activist perspective. I'm also a social activist quilt artist. Behind me is a quilt that I made for presentation, Cradle to Prison Pipeline, and in the section of that presentation where we were showing how parents of color send an alternative message to their children about inclusion and giftedness, I created this piece to represent for little girls wearing dresses made with African prints. Thank you, and I'm excited to be here today.
Okay, thank you. And we have also my friend Dr. Julius Bailey in studio today.
Hello. I want to thank you, Robin, for again putting together this conference, the Great Lakes Black Authors Conference, and appreciate the artwork that you put in toward that. I certainly was proud to be a part of the first rendition, and equally as proud to be here today. I am Professor Julius Bailey. I'm a professor of philosophy and African American Studies at Wittenberg University, Springfield, Ohio. I am knock on some wood, I ain't got that around, but I am 2 months away, I guess, from being promoted to full professor. And so I'm excited about that. Now, if the board of trustees say no, then I won't be excited, but I think I should be all right. I am an author of 6 books, 5 of them academic, 2 of them deal with politics and our sort of current time, if you will. One of them was a memoir, and three of them dealt with popular culture and hip hop. Certainly, this conversation today spans the globe of all that I'm interested in. I don't consider myself a writer as much as I consider myself a reader and a thinker. And so writing becomes sort of one of the ways in which I sort of put out to the public the stories that we tell. And I think what we'll talk about today is the ways in which various forms of storytelling becomes crucial within this grand scheme called America.
Okay. All righty. So we're going to jump right in because it's a lot of information. Every year, the Great Lakes Black Authors will have a panel with the professors in residence to educate the masses on the topics to correlate the topics to literature. And so this year, we're talking about the literacy laws, the anti-literacy laws from the 1800s. We want to say the 1800s because historically it seems to move around. Somebody's giving me feedback. I don't know if you're listening on something, but okay. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to read something from one of the literacy laws, or a couple of the literacy laws from the 1800s, just to give us a historical understanding. And this one is from South Carolina, the Act of 1740. It says, whereas the having of slaves taught to write or suffering them to be employed in writing may be intended with great inconveniences, be it enacted that all and every person whatsoever who shall hereafter teach or cause any slaves to be taught to write, or shall use or employ any slaves as scribes in any manner of writing whatsoever hereafter taught to write, every such person or persons shall for every such offense forfeit the sum of £100 current money. So there was a financial fine for any white person teaching Black people how to read. And then in Virginia in 1819, they made it unlawful. I'm going to skip to the punishment. He may issue a warrant direct to any sworn officer or officers authorizing him or her to enter the house or houses where such unlawful assemblages, because getting together assemblages like school, and may be for the purpose of apprehending or dispersing such slaves, and inflict corporal punishment on the offender or offenders at the discretion of any justice of the peace, not exceeding 20 lashes. So it was also punishable with corporal punishment. So understanding or getting that backdrop of the laws, can we discuss what these literacy laws were about, and the slave code and what the slave code was about? I'll pass it to Dr. Harrison first and then to Dr. Bailey.
So it's Professor Harrison. I don't have a doctorate.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. People do that all the time. Not a big deal. Well, I just think that one of the things that we have to consider is that this is about control, right? So that first, to represent for African Americans, that the idea to write could actually help you to write yourself out of the institution of slavery. If we look at someone like Frederick Douglass, there's an attempt by him to write himself out of the institution of slavery by writing a pass as he was going on a chore for his master. He wrote passes for himself and other members of the group, only to be ratted out. And so he went to a house where a woman gave them biscuits, and they literally ate those passes so that they wouldn't be caught with paper, with written materials on their person. So part of it is first about control, keeping you in that institution because your value is your labor, not your knowledge in terms of your education that would get you out of that system of servitude.
Okay.
And I think that, I appreciate that sort of beginning with control, because again, when we think about, the American tapestry, we have to begin with the original lie, right? We have to begin with this idea of what freedom is and how freedom is represented. I think that, if we tell a Jamestown story, for instance, and so even if we try to begin there with 16 Africans on the shores of Virginia,
Mhm.
America, engages, or Britain engages in a story even before Jamestown, right? It engages in this sort of Britain and Spain and others begin this sort of complicated extraction of indigenous folk. And so for me, to since writing is so much about storytelling, the slave codes become as Professor Harrison says, becomes a question of control. But it's who controls the narrative, right? Who controls the ways in which the story of America is told? Who becomes who's able to identify the ways in which we can shape or craft this grand experiment of democracy in America? And so I think if we think about that first and then ask, how revolutionary then does it mean to have somebody like Frederick Douglass to be able to tell a story, or to have um, those individuals who are able to risk life and limb in order to be able to tell a story that become not just emancipatory sort of viscerally, but also emancipatory literally, right? And so I think slave codes were intentionally engaged, not just with writing, right? We know that literacy is one of them,
Mm-hmm.
but it had a lot of different other elements in terms of marriage and other things like that too. But it's all about the institution, all about the various institutions that allow for humanity, right? And so if we understand slavery as initially a process of dehumanization, then my ability to tell a story, my ability to identify who I am through my voice and through whether it's song, whether it's writing, whether whatever, my ability to do that is my ability to assert my identity, and my inability is then to continually become subjugated under this American lie called democracy.
Yes, Dr. Bailey, I think it's so important what you said about humanity. African Americans and Africans who were forcefully migrated for their free labor to this continent were constantly trying to assert their humanity. And one way to assert that humanity was through literacy. So we take someone
Mhm.
like Sojourner Truth, who was illiterate, couldn't read and couldn't write. And when you talk about fashion in the narrative, she actually takes pictures of herself that she will sell. And what's in the backdrop? A book. What is the
Mm-hmm.
book? The Bible. And while she couldn't read or write, she remembered passages, long passages from the Bible that she could preach about. She would tell you that she could read people even though she couldn't read the written word. And she knew the Spirit, and the Spirit called her. So James Oney wrote a famous piece of a famous document about people enslaved who are writing, and he noted that those works, those slave narratives, if you will, would start with "I was born," which is a way to say I am a human being. So I think what
Mhm.
you're getting at is really powerful, intentional on the part of Africans who were enslaved to talk about themselves as being born. They just didn't rise out of nowhere. And that their narratives, they controlled those narratives as to what was important. Oftentimes we'll see things like, this was so cool, it's so cool, I can't describe it. And then in the next breath, they would go on to describe the cruelty and the
Mm.
inhumanity of white people while they're denying your humanity. They're saying, this is inhumane. This is what was done to me. This is so awful. The number of lashes that I took, I can't describe it. And then they would go right along again and describe it. And I think for me, one of the central figures of that is Jacobs, who talks
Yeah.
about their, not just confinement in the institution of slavery, but in seeking freedom, she confined herself in order to free herself. It is a fascinating story. So I really appreciate you talking about that part of exerting our humanity. And the unfortunate thing is, in this modern, postmodern era, we are still doing it.
No question. And for me, and then I'll be short here, Robin. I think for me, I came, I remember I think it was graduate school, Professor. I think the first time I read Orlando Patterson, and a letter, and Orlando Patterson, the great historian, defined slavery with sort of a few components, right? One was his idea of permanence. One was his idea of violence. But the other piece that really caught my attention was that he said it's a process of natal alienation, right? And so I remember that.
Uh-oh. Did I freeze or did Dr. Bailey freeze?
Dr. Bailey throws.
Okay. All right. Hopefully that can get worked out in a second. For those who are tuned in, put your questions in the chat, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook Live. We will have a Q&A portion at the end. So, make sure that if you have any questions, feel free to interact with this discussion that we're getting lots and lots of information from. And let me shoot Dr. Bailey a text that he's frozen.
Okay.
Did he unfreeze? Nope. Okay.
No,
I'm going to shoot him a text to say you're frozen, and hopefully he will log out and log back in.
okay.
So in the meantime, okay, he logged out, so he'll be back. And the next question then becomes, and we talked a little bit about this already, but just to expound on it, how influential were the slave narratives and as far as helping bring about the abolishment of slavery?
Okay. I think one of the things to keep in mind about slave narratives is there was over 6,000 of them. So when someone like Hegel says African Americans have no history, you have those narratives that are noting that history, and not only narratives, but African Americans are writing fictional pieces. So again, it's about humanity. You can imagine. And so if whites want to, and the planter class, slaveholders want to say that these people are not really people, these people tell you that not only can I tell my story, I can also imagine. And so they will write and create fictions around the history of being Africans enslaved in America, talking about Middle Passage, talking about uh, being mulattoes and what that means, and we'll create stories. So I think the beauty of our history is that, first of all, it's a shared history in this country. Secondly, as contemporaries, if we believe that we have nothing to learn from our ancestors, nothing that we would be ashamed of them when somebody talk about the institution of slavery. The shame is on the planter class and the slave class that enslaved people. The fact that we survived and surpassed what someone said couldn't be done is a way to thank those ancestors. By virtue of them, we are here today.
Yeah. And you mentioned a few of the writers in the midst of these anti-literacy laws. Who were the well-known literature of the time? You mentioned Frederick Douglass and Phillis Wheatley. Was it was that a growing thing at the time in the states that did not abolish
So
literacy?
you had numerous. And I would say Phyllis Wheatley is important because when you get to the canon of literature, she's an American writer and she's also a British writer. And
Okay.
in the early 1700s, you have this young woman, I think it was 1767, at the age of 14, she publishes her first collection of poetry. A few years later, all the heads of state, so the governors of Boston, the leaders of Boston, have this young woman in a room asking her questions about her narrative to certify that she indeed wrote it. So that will become another critical piece in a literacy, that you have to have these white male leaders assert that you actually wrote this. Now, isn't that powerful?
Wow. Wow.
When you're not supposed to acquire literacy, and that they would, in the preface of the book, we are certifying that this woman wrote this narrative.
Wow.
It
Wow.
happened with a number of narratives. And then if we move to the period of the abolitionist movement and the lecturing of the Underground Railroad, you have people like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who is on that circuit giving speeches. And then you have someone like William Steele, who is, as people enslaved are seeking freedom, and he's helping them in their escape, either north or further north to Canada. He starts to chronicle their stories. So even if they are not literate where they can write, they speak.
Yeah.
And Steele chronicles these stories, and he gives us this collection of voices of people who are seeking their freedom. They talk about their families. And that there it is again. They had families.
Yeah.
In an institution that denies your humanity, denies the birthright of people, they talk about being family. So I think those are the really powerful takeaways about these folks.
Dr. Bailey, welcome back. Thank you for coming back. Thought you ran away for a second there. We're just talking about right now just the difference in the midst of these anti-literacy laws, the prevalence of literature coming from Black writers. And were there any noteworthy writers that you wanted to bring to the forefront from that time?
Right. No, I mean, I'm sorry to you, your audience, as well as Professor Harrison. Um, without hearing her conversation, I don't want to step in there. So I would just simply say that certainly writers have had to, create the continuity. I think as you move, I'm assuming as you move from slave codes to Black codes and to freedom, I think you have to, just remember that there's a continuity to this story. And I always say all the time, even when I'm talking about hip hop, right? I'm like, there's this continuity of sort of, how do you tell a story about identity as well as community in search of joy, in search of community, while also dealing with the one thing I did hear her say was the devaluing and the erasure, right, of voice, right? And so when you have to deal with the killing fields of the plantations, when you have to deal with Jim Crow and the rise of lynchings and black bodies in creeks and hanging on trees, and when you got to deal with the disparate laws related to whether it comes to where can I eat, where can I drink, where can I walk, that kind of stuff, to even quite frankly to even now, right, in terms of in what ways can I navigate through my proverbial white spaces, right? I mean, I'm sure me and Professor Harrison, as well as you Robin, but even in education, right? I mean, there's ways in which we have to we have to be radical as well as almost be accommodating in order to keep our jobs, right? In order to continue to be radical, right? So it's like, I mean, you can't be too radical, right? Because then you don't got a job, right? And then you're not able to influence the people that needs to be influenced. but then you can't be too accommodating to the extent that you don't become a truth teller in the story. And so, so what becomes important for all these writers, people like I'm a fan of David Walker, for instance, right?
Mhm.
And so when David Walker says, "Listen, I'm just going to put this in the hands of you, America," right? These are your words, right? We're trying to operate under your type of rules in which you're trying to tell the world that you're consistent with this story about freedom and liberation and that kind of thing. But yet you aren't operating within that message, right? Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. You know what I'm saying? That kind of thing, right? So the
Right.
reality is that I'm excited about the ways in which the trajectory of that 18th and 19th century storytelling was one that affirmed humanity, one that spoke truth to power, one that risked death, in many cases did die, and one that made sure, like a David Walker or like a Nat Turner, that made sure that if I'm going to die, there's going to be a story to be told about it, which as we move into the 20th century becomes the importance of people like Ida B. Wells and others, right?
Mhm.
That our deaths, right, must have a story and a name associated with it, right? Because that goes back to what I know I was, when I was cut off, it goes back to what Orlando Patterson talks about, is that we have to constantly avoid natal alienation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Bailey, I think what you're saying is powerful. Part of the continuity also.
Getting some static with you, Professor Harrison.
Okay.
I need you to
So
start over. Okay, there you go.
okay, one of the things I think is powerful about what you're saying in terms of that continuity, you also talked about different styles of writing. So there's the autobiographical, there's the fiction, there are people like Ida B. Wells Barnett, who is a journalist. So there's journalistic work and investigative work that is happening. If we go back to somebody like Harriet, what is her name? I'm thinking of the woman who wrote Our Nig, uh, her name is escaping me for a moment. But anyway, that she writes her autobiography. The fact that David Walker is reminiscent of what we will find Martin Luther King Jr. doing later when he talks about this piece of paper that is supposed to represent freedom and democracy, well, it doesn't apply to African Americans in this country. And so
Right.
all of these different types of writing is really indicative of what we're seeing today, because you mentioned rap, and at the same time we see coming out of the continent of Africa that people who will migrate here forcefully will create music, the
Mhm.
blues. And one of the things is that repetition. The first line of the blues song is always repeated as the second line of that song. So that repetition of telling the story, not just through the written word, but through song, through dance, through other art forms. We will be the inventors of art forms as people are having conversations today in country music about whether or not we have a place there. It is our place because it's our history. We are the foundation. Jazz is an American music medium invented by Africans who were forcefully migrated here. So, in all fields of art as well as literature, we see the voices of our ancestors.
No question.
I want to move forward to, well, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the literary societies that developed during that time that helped push slavery, to help abolish slavery. You talked about it a little bit. We mentioned it. The literary societies of Pittsburgh and Boston and New York, they all had literary societies that were collecting the narratives and um, using the stories to, like you said, to humanize the African American race to push out slavery, and then moving forward from that into um, the the Jim Crow era and use of literacy to actually keep Black people from voting and other things like that. Let's talk about that era and civil rights and separate but equal and all of that and how the role literacy played in that.
Right. Well, I think, I always, like to remind students that, when we enter into the 20th century, we are, having to deal, as you say, with sort of post-Reconstruction, and the sort of the sort of a continuation of institutional violence, even in the midst of quote unquote freedom, right? And so, what becomes interesting for me are the ways in which Black folk begin to create journals, right, and newspapers, right? And so these journals and newspapers, not different from what was the Harrison's Liberator, right, of the emancipation. But these writers and newspapers that, in many cases, are sort of arc at the same time as these organizations, right? So if we're talking about Du Bois, right, we're talking about the crisis as well as the work as the NAACP is doing. If we're talking about the National Urban League, we're talking about also its writing arm, and we're talking about Brother Garvey, right? I talk about his writing arm, right? And so writing, and again, being able to chronicle the news of the day, the operations of the day, the sort of the synergy between the political activity of a people, as well as the day-to-day activities of the people in terms of lived experiences and those type of things, become tantamount to what it means to go through a civil rights era. And so, in short, I would just say that you cannot. It's not too far. It's a little bit different, right? But you cannot. Even if you think about what Black Lives Matters means today, you're not going to have a Black Lives Matter without Twitter and Facebook, right? And so the reality is that there's always been the on the ground work that's also linked to the written element, that individuals can come at it from different perspectives and then allow for the chronicling of the story while at the same time people are on the ground working.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to think about, Dr. Bailey, as you're talking about that, is so we start with the Underground Railroad, those narratives collected by William Steele, and then you have Ida B. Wells Barnett chronicling through her record of lynchings in America. And then you have the North Star and other liberating newspapers. And then we get to these organizations like the NAACP, the Alpha Clubs, that Black women, and then you get to the Call and Post. And that's that day-to-day stuff that you're talking about. What's happening in the Black church, what's happening in Black society, what's happening, recipes. You have someone like Frederick Douglass Opie, who has chronicled the history of the civil rights movement through food, but indicative of that, he uses newspapers to talk, how newspapers called for protests. Don't shop where you can't be hired. Don't eat where you have to go to the back window, or that you can't sit in this restaurant and eat. So there were many forms of writing that African Americans pulled into in order to tell those stories, in order to organize the clubs from nowhere during the civil rights movement, where Black women are preparing food to help fund the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott. So all of these things are happening simultaneously. And you're right when you talk about Black Lives Matters. Without the medium forms that we have today, would not be as possible in terms of global reach that they have gathered as they would be today, because they have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have Instagram, We have all of these mediums that are going around the world. And we can even look at the Arab Spring a few years ago, that again, that social network, a medium to spread the word.
Okay. Someone said they missed part of what you said, Dr. Bailey, Regina Glover. There can't be a Black Lives Matter without. I just want to give a moment to clarify for her.
No. What I said was that when we're talking about the connections between on the ground, person to person, door by door, grassroots work, they've always been a literary arm to that, right? There's always been some written chronicling of what's about to happen, what had happened, and what should happen, right? And so when we think about something like BLM, right, we cannot divorce everything from the political aspect of BLM to the social aspect of BLM. We cannot divorce that to the role of this media that we have in terms of Twitter, Facebook, things like that, right? And so that may be different, right? Because the role of newspapers are different now than it was when, Chicago Defender or the Baltimore, I can think of the name of the Baltimore paper right now, or the Jet magazine, right? Ebony magazines, right? Those become an important aspect to the civil rights movement, right? But quite frankly, when we think about the 21st century, I don't mean to advance us too far, but given the question that was asked, we don't want to divorce media as it is and media as it was. Does that make sense?
Right. It's the evolution of it. It's not one, in place of the other.
Right.
Definitely.
And one other thing to add is that Patrice Kahn Colliers wrote a narrative. She wrote a memoir called When They Call You a Terrorist, the Black Lives Matters memoir. And in it, she chronicles the history of racism and classism and in America, especially in the LA area where she lived, so that you see the rise of the prison industrial complex. So she tells that story, her autobiographical story. And then the other half of the book, she tells the story about the rise of Black Lives Matter. How did we matter? How did we start? These are the women that came together. This was our first step. This was our next step. We don't go into communities and tell people what to do. We go into communities and we listen and we talk about healing because people are suffering. Before we do anything else, we do that. So she's using numerous tools, the technology that she has available to her at the moment that Black Lives Matter is created, but also to write a narrative to set the record straight. So when the FBI in 2017 says there's something called extreme Black identity, Collier said, here is the extreme Black identity. This white supremacy is not called terrorism, but we are, because we are invoking our humanity. So there are always more than one tool used. So there's a story to be told. And then there's the story of how Black Lives Matter started so that no one else gets to name it and write the narrative for us.
Right.
That's good. Let me pivot to the last point I want to get to. I'd read somewhere as far as during the slavery times and the anti-literacy laws, it developed a reaction amongst the Black people to not want to read because you didn't want to deal with the consequences. And so here we are now, however 100 years later, and we skipped over a lot. Hold on. Illiteracy is still a nationwide issue in our community. National Assessment of Educational Progress found in 2017 that just 18% of Black 8th graders reached reading proficiency. And in 2015, 17% of 12th graders were proficient. Why do you feel that this is still a problem in our community?
So I'm gonna jump in there real quickly, and I'm gonna let Professor Harrison kind of do her thing with this. Um, you know, I'm gonna be very careful when I say this, but I think that part of it has to do with adjustment and comfortability. Right? What do I mean by that? And it doesn't necessarily mean in a pejorative way, right? And so, for instance, as you mentioned, Robin, that if I am on a plantation or if I am an ex-slave that's still under, some sense of servitude, and I'm hearing, stories about what literacy has done for some, and it may not have been a good thing. And I realize that there's a comfortability in doing your job, whatever your job is. There's a comfortability, there's a livelihood, whether we call it authentic or not. There is something about preservation that has to do with just working in the field, just, shucking the corn, just, whatever it is that I have to do just to make it to see my children again, or just to make sure that I can take care of my children, or that I can stay with my spouse, right? Those becomes a question of adjustment, right? And so I say that to say, again, not a pejorative way, because then you got those more radical folk who are like, look, you can't be adjusted in a system of injustice without fighting it, right? So you got your Nat Turners and them and all them saying, no, that ain't good enough. But think about Du Bois Washington, right? Think about how that correlation is there. Think about the ways in which Washington, no matter how we look at it, Washington loved Black folk, right? Du Bois loves Black folk. They did not love Black folk. The question just became for them, right? What is it that allows Black folk to flourish, right? To become either comfortable or adjusted in a civilization that they've yet to gain full power in. And so literacy, for instance, becomes almost what Du Bois says becomes an element of the talented tenth, right? There's only a few people who have access to it, right? And when you have access to it, then you have certain responsibilities, no question. But you're only talking about, upon emancipation, you're only talking about what, 10, 15% of Black folk, right? And so when we're talking about this conversation in the 20th century, you're still only even with the growth of Black colleges, you're still only talking about a sliver of society. And then you got 75, 80% of other Black folk that got to continue to live, right? And so to tie this back into today's conversation, reading is not only power, but it's also responsibility. And so when you have a mediated culture that attempts to absolve your responsibility by distracting you, as some people say, weapons of mass distraction, reading then becomes a revolutionary act up against the mass distraction of Twitter and Facebook and music and all that kind of stuff. Some of it is revolutionary, some of it is educational, and some of it is just what? Adjustment. Is just accommodation. And quite frankly, and this, I'll just end here and we can maybe come back. Unfortunately, there are some of us, as Cornel West says, who have become too adjusted to injustice, right? And there's two of us to become, and then there's others of us who are maladjusted to injustice. And so I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but the idea of what it means to survive, one must make that existential choice and said, listen, I don't want, if I read too much, I know too much. And if I know too much, I'm responsible for too much. If I'm responsible for too much, now I have to do some more personal investigation. What does my life mean? But if I don't know, or if I act like I don't know, and I just go to work, I do what I got to do, I take care of my family, we making it, we are right, we are part of the American dream, if you will. But the American dream has always been to keep you under, right? Not to keep you over. I'll just be quiet. Let Professor Harrison.
Well, I love what you're saying. I think one of the things we have to think about is, earlier you talked about really moving without really moving. Ralph Ellison is saying that when we're in the academy, we have to move and we have to perform in a certain way so that we're not looking like we're moving. That is really important. We have to think about the Black Panthers. What was one of the first programs that they started? Acquiring literacy by knowing your history, right? feeding African American children before school because we know they're going to function better in school with full belly. Having programs after school for their parents to further educate their parents so they can impact the educational system in which their kids are placed into. I think one of the other things is what is acquiring literacy. There are multiple ways in which young people can acquire literacy. Graphic novels is an excellent tool to introduce folks to in terms of acquiring literacy because it's not that hardcore, dense text that you and I may share in a classroom. Is something that has pictures, it mirrors a comic book, but is still acquiring literacy. And we have to just first practice reading, let our young folks see us reading, buy
Yeah.
them books and build libraries. One of the things I've done with all of my grandchildren is from the moment they were born, they got books. But I also bought a copy of the same book and put it on my own shelf. So they didn't have to leave home and take their books from home. Those same books was on my bookshelf. And so those books were history books, but also very playful, fictional pieces that they could see themselves. And then at the same time, because we were part of this dominant culture, I wanted to make sure that they understood the materials that were written by the dominant culture for the dominant culture, but we could
Right.
take those and talk about those stories as how they exclude us. So all of that becomes part of how we need to push literacy to this generation, understand that there are books that are still banned, like W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks, in our prison industrial complex. Our young men can't get access to that or access to Malcolm X's work, which really becomes important because it's talking about freedom, and freeing oneself starts with
Right.
freeing one's mind and freeing one's heart. And so if we get our folks to the point that they're starting to free their minds and think for themselves, they are going to gravitate towards works. And
That
our jobs is to encourage that.
that's
Give
going to be the second
them
panel today. Our second panel that's going to be at 1 o'clock is we have two men who are formerly incarcerated, and they're going to expound on that whole discussion about the freeing of the mind and how correlating that with the freedom we've been talking about all this session. So that's going to be a very good discussion, moderated by Tony Fleming. Um, there's a
So
question.
Robin,
We're in the Q&A section. Oh, did you want to say something, Dr. K?
just real quickly, I think, and I'm just reminded again in terms of the context that me and Professor Harrison are in, and I'm just thinking about the ways in which higher education has become or is becoming more and more industrialized, right? And more business oriented, and more very specifically element to everything, quite frankly, except for reading, except for personal investigation, except for the question of the humanities, right? And so I'm thinking about that at the same time that America continues to foster this conversation about our exceptionalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so our exceptionalism then, as it was even at slavery, is a question of imperialism, right? How do we gain access to power, to money, to wealth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the ways in which our education system now is even continuing in that story, while our humanities is being sort of continually beaten down, is because it don't make money. And if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense.
Right.
And so meanwhile, you have corporations who are involved in our educational system, which I know ain't a part of this conversation.
That's okay.
But when your schools is brought to you by Walmart, or when your schools is brought to you by Bill Gates, right? They're not concerned about emancipatory processes. They aren't concerned about liberating of minds. They aren't concerned about the ways in which the individual is linked to what? The community, which is what these stories that he's talking about in terms of Octavia Butler's story and that legacy, Ishmael Reed and that legacy, right? Those are stories of imagination. Those are stories of community. And in a nation that continues to promulgate itself as highly individualistic and highly success oriented, you're not going to have a community conversation that is what literacy is linked to. Right. And so I think this is why we fight in the humanities, and we fight within departments like English and others across the country, is because we're becoming almost obsolete as they're trying to create more business folk and more, not to say there shouldn't be, trying to create more nursing folk. Not to say there shouldn't be, but of nursing folk to understand how health is linked to identity, and identity is linked to history, and history is linked to the ways in which white supremacy operates. Then what the hell you got there? You see what I'm saying? And let me just be quiet. I gotta go. But I'm saying that's just what reminds me, very much reminds me of what Professor Harrison talks about, is that we can't absolve the fact that education, literacy is tied to an education, and when we don't have a nation that puts primacy on literacy as a part of the educative process, and they're doing more testing than learning, and they're doing more evaluation than they are introspection and community building, then we continue to lose.
Yeah, and this is why critical thinking is so important, in teaching critical thinking in our classrooms. And the best class that I have is when a student leaves there and he or she or they are asking me, what should I be reading? What material? Because once I put a book or two in their hands, they're going to find other writers that they need to integrate into their lives and into their reading list. And that becomes really, really important. So part of it is modeling and mirroring reading of all kinds of types. STEM programs are really important. We need people of color in the STEMs. We need Black people in STEM. We already have a history in the STEMs if we go back to Benjamin Banneker.
No question.
There is a history right there, right? And so to read his story is to know what kid is in. He's not going to just go with the narrative that has been handed to him or her or them, right? That have already been there. And that's, for me, that is the beauty of literacy in the African American community.
We do have one question. I want to try to get this in these last few minutes. Do you, and we might have discussed a little bit of this, but just to expound on it, do you see a correlation between fear, literacy, and access to reading, learning?
And what kind of reading and learning?
Just reading and learning, access to it. So there's the correlation between fear, literacy, and then access.
I'm going to say really quick, one of the things, and Dr. Bailey touched on this, if I acquire literacy, if I get a degree, high school degree, college degree, doctorate, I have a responsibility, because that's what we have been handed, that when you move up, you are supposed to reach back and bring folks with you, right? Sometimes there's a fear of success, not just a fear of failure. What is going to be asked of me? I think that's where fear stems from. But also, what if I acquire, am I moving away from our community? We've all heard somebody say, when we get an education, you're not one of us anymore. You all these kinds of ways that we don't fit in or belong anymore. And I think that's part of the fear of acquiring an education through acquiring literacy. And it's real. Those of us who have attained certain levels of education, we all felt it at some point. But there has to be a way for us to say to our students, to all folks in our community, there is and has always been room for both. So Dr. Du Bois' talented 10th, alongside of the masses, that under the 90% that is necessary to fuel our community, should not be denied.
Yeah, and I think the way I would respond real quickly is that, and I'm glad you did that, Professor Harrison, because I wasn't thinking of that since when the question was raised. I was thinking the fear that's connected to self-love, right? And so when I first heard the question, I'm thinking, there's always been, again, when we're talking about the legacy of white supremacy and the legacy of the devaluing of Black identity and the devaluing of Black bodies, associated with that is the fear to love oneself within the midst of the devaluing. And right. And so that's why the beauty of a period like the 60s in America, not to take away everything that happened in the 18th and 19th century, but the beautiful thing about the 60s, from everything from James Brown to Sonia Sanchez to Barack Obama, Baraka, he married Baraka. Is this, sorry about Barack Obama, I didn't mean to say that, but is this idea of I love being Black, right? And so when you're able to say I love being Black, think about for a minute, catch this. Think about for a minute, especially in the academy this happens. Think about the ways in which many Black folk have to now use language like people of color as opposed to Black folk. Right? Think about ways that we have, not to say there's anything wrong with it being inclusive and expansive in the ways in which oppression operates. I'm not saying that. But if I'm trying to assert my love for Black folk, why I gotta couch it in a conversation around everybody? Right? Because in many cases, to affirm Black love, i.e., what you said earlier about the Black love of Malcolm X, the Black love of Marcus Garvey, the Black love of Du Bois and others, to affirm Black loves mean at a certain level, what happens? All lives matters. I don't give a damn what you're talking about. I'm trying to speak about a particular subgroup, if you will, within the American experiment that'll always be devalued. So don't take away I love Black people or Black Lives Matter because you're afraid to sort of allow the speak, as Spivak says, to let the subaltern speak, right? And so I took the question of fear and literacy in the sense that some of us are, because again, to lead is to love, we serve and to serve to love. I took that fear is because when we become to love ourselves, now we love our history. And we love our history, we love our communities that made it through our history. And so when I hear people devalue the church, Christianity, are able to devalue even Islam, are able to devalue whatever. I'm like, you're devaluing the very sustenance of the people that have made it this far, right? I'm like, do you even love yourself, brother? Do you love yourself, sister? Or are you loving yourself through the guise and eyes of white supremacy? And if that's the case, it's hard for us to have a connection, a conversation, because I get what you're doing. Some of it ain't your fault, brother. Some of it ain't your fault, sister. You are a victim in a sense. But in other sense, you cannot play into the language games that devalues Black love through the service that we do in reading and writing and the gift of the written word.
And one last point I want to make. You nail it when you say that there is a blueprint. Daniel, who certainly loved herself, who is being chastised about what she's writing, about how she's writing, what she's not writing about, of suffering. And she's writing about celebration of Black women and Black women's bodies. And then there will be a long list of women who will come after her. And so it is about, again, asserting your humanity, but not just to the dominant culture, but within yourself and to yourself. And so it really becomes important that that fear of failure and that fear of success do not take away from you the fact that you are a capable, sentient being, a human being that has made an incredible contribution to this experiment that we call democracy.
We are out of time. We got some comments. As please make that your next book, Dr. B. Kristen Stephen Roach says. Excellent panel. You guys are getting some praise here. We are out of time. Thank you for making the correlation. I think we are at a point in our time where we've always been as, but I think we're getting a disconnect of understanding correlation, causality. We can understand it for everyone else and everything else. But when it comes to the Black community, why are you all still complaining? Why is there violence? Why is there this and that? When we have to put the historical lens on this and understand that we're in this position that we are in now because there were laws created in the beginning and enforced and revamped over the years. I wouldn't say that they were necessarily abolished. They were revamped over the years, and we still are dealing with the effects of don't teach a Black person to read, otherwise they'll realize they're human. So I thank you for joining me in this session, and we will continue this discussion at 1 o'clock with a different panel. Like I said earlier, two previously incarcerated men sharing their experiences and how reading helps set them free. And but before that, at 11:30, we have our keynote speaker, Corey Sykes, joining us. If you have not officially registered for the conference on the Great Lakes Black Author webpage, go get your RSVPs in, because you'll be entered into a contest that she's giving away a couple prizes. So make sure you do that, and make sure you attend the keynote section at 11:30 to get an opportunity to get a free published book. Not free, but a discounted published book from Writing by Publishing. So thank you, too, for joining me today. I appreciate all your knowledge. We probably went for another hour, but we did it, and we fit it in. And you get well. Finish getting well, Dr. Bailey. Thank you for giving me your time. And if anyone didn't notice, Denise Harrison has one of her quilts in the background. She's a quilter, and she tells stories through quilts. And she was a Griot Award winner from last year because of her storytelling for quilts. So I will get her in the expo. Probably not today, probably be tomorrow. And so anyone wants to see what she's done, they can visit the expo and get information for Denise Harrison. Thank you all. I'm going to pull you guys out, and well, I'm just going to put on the video, and I will see everyone else at 11 o'clock, at 11:30 for the 11:30 for the keynote. All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.